Laci Peterson was a 27-year-old woman living in Modesto, California, in the United States. She was known for her gentle personality, warm smile, and deep love for family. Friends described her as caring, organized, and hopeful about the future. At the time her story began, Laci was 8 months pregnant with her first child, a baby boy she planned to name Connor. Her life revolved around preparing for motherhood, decorating the nursery, and dreaming about the life she was about to begin. To the outside world, Laci's life appeared calm and stable. She was married, expecting a child, and living in a quiet suburban neighborhood. She enjoyed simple routines, walking her dog, grocery shopping, and staying connected with family. Christmas was approaching, and Laci was excited to celebrate the holidays as a soon-to-be mother. There were no visible signs that anything was wrong. On the morning of December 24, 2002, Laci disappeared. According to her husband, she had planned to walk the family dog before preparing for Christmas Eve. When she did not return home, concern slowly turned into alarm. By evening, family members realized something was seriously wrong. Laci was heavily pregnant, responsible, and not the kind of person who would disappear without telling anyone. A missing person report was filed, and the search began immediately. Neighbors, volunteers, and law enforcement combed the area. Flyers with Laci's photograph were distributed throughout the city. Her image, smiling, visibly pregnant, quickly spread across news channels. The public was deeply affected by the idea that a pregnant woman could vanish from a peaceful neighborhood in broad daylight. As days passed with no sign of Laci, national attention intensified. Candlelight vigils were held. Reporters gathered outside her home. The case struck an emotional chord, especially with women and expectant mothers who imagined themselves in her place. Very early on, questions began to emerge. Investigators started examining Laci's personal life, daily routines, and relationships. Nothing suggested she had run away. She had left behind personal belongings, unfinished plans, and no note. Her phone activity stopped suddenly. Everything pointed toward foul play. As the investigation continued, attention shifted closer to home. Her husband's statements, timeline, and behavior came under scrutiny. While he publicly appealed for Laci's safe return, inconsistencies began to surface. Media coverage became intense and relentless. Every word, gesture, and interview was analyzed. The case slowly transformed from a missing person search into a suspected homicide investigation. Despite the growing suspicion, Laci was still missing. Weeks turned into months. Hope began to fade, but her family refused to stop searching. They emphasized that Laci was more than a headline. She was a daughter, a sister, and a mother who never got to hold her child. Her unborn son became a symbol of stolen futures and unanswered questions. In April 2003, the case took a devastating turn. Human remains were discovered near the San Francisco Bay. DNA testing confirmed the worst fear: Laci Peterson and her unborn son were dead. The discovery sent shockwaves through the nation. Grief was replaced by anger, and the demand for justice grew louder than ever. The case now shifted fully into a murder investigation. Laci's story was no longer about disappearance alone. It became a story about trust, betrayal, and how violence can hide behind ordinary appearances. The public followed every development closely, not just to see what would happen next, but to understand how such a tragedy could occur to a woman who seemed so safe. Her face remained on screens across the world not as a mystery, but as a reminder of vulnerability. She had done nothing wrong. She was living an ordinary life, preparing for motherhood, believing she was safe. Laci Peterson's story forced difficult conversations about domestic safety, accountability, and how often warning signs are recognized too late. It showed that danger does not always come from strangers, and that justice often begins only after irreversible loss. This was only the beginning of a long legal battle, one that would divide public opinion, dominate headlines, and become one of the most talked about true crime cases in modern history. And for Laci, justice had not yet been spoken.
As the search for Laci Peterson intensified, the focus of the investigation began to narrow. What initially appeared to be a tragic disappearance soon revealed layers of deception, contradictions, and deeply troubling evidence. The nation watched closely as law enforcement worked to uncover the truth behind what happened to the pregnant woman who vanished on Christmas Eve, From the beginning, investigators paid close attention to Laci's husband, Scott Peterson. While it is routine in missing person cases to question spouses, Scott's behavior quickly raised concerns. His timeline of events on the morning Laci disappeared contained inconsistencies. He claimed to have gone fishing that day, despite the cold weather and the holiday. This detail stood out to investigators, especially when they discovered that Laci had expressed fear of being alone late in her pregnancy and rarely went out without informing someone. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered information that shifted the entire case. Scott Peterson was living a double life. Investigators learned that he had been involved in an extramarital affair for several months before Laci's disappearance. Even more disturbing, he had told the woman he was seeing that his wife was already dead before Laci was officially reported missing. This revelation shocked both investigators and the public, fundamentally changing how the case was viewed. Media coverage exploded. Scott Peterson's image was broadcast nationwide as journalists questioned his public pleas and emotional responses. While he appeared calm and composed in interviews, many viewers felt something was off. Candlelight vigils continued for Laci, but public opinion slowly shifted. Sympathy for Scott faded as suspicion grew. Law enforcement began tracking Scott's movements closely. Surveillance teams followed him, monitored his phone calls, and documented his behavior. What they observed raised further red flags. Scott sold Laci's car, inquired about selling the house, and showed little outward concern about her whereabouts. To investigators, these actions suggested preparation for a future without his wife. Meanwhile, the discovery of Laci and her unborn son's remains near the San Francisco Bay became a crucial turning point. The location was eerily close to where Scott claimed he had gone fishing on the day she disappeared. This connection strengthened the case against him and provided a clear geographic link between his story and the crime scene. Forensic evidence, while largely circumstantial, began to form a compelling narrative. Anchors made from concrete were found to match materials Scott had access to. Fibers, timelines, and witness statements all aligned in ways that pointed toward one conclusion. Though there were no direct eyewitnesses to the crime, the accumulation of evidence painted a disturbing picture. Laci's family remained vocal throughout the investigation. Her mother and siblings spoke publicly about her character, emphasizing that she would never abandon her child or disappear willingly. They described her excitement about becoming a mother and her strong ties to family. Their voices reminded the public that behind the legal drama was a woman whose life had been brutally stolen. As the case progressed, Scott Peterson was arrested in April 2003. He was charged with 2 counts of murder, one for Laci and one for her unborn son, Connor. The arrest marked a moment of grim relief for Laci's family, who had waited months for accountability, yet it also signaled the beginning of a long and painful legal battle. The arrest itself drew intense media attention. Scott was found carrying large amounts of cash, multiple cell phones, and items that suggested he might flee. This discovery further damaged his credibility and fueled public belief in his guilt. To many, it appeared as though he was preparing to escape justice. The case now moved toward trial, becoming one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in American history. Legal experts debated the strength of the evidence, while the public formed strong opinions on both sides. Supporters of Scott argued that the case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence. Others believed the pattern of lies and behavior made his guilt undeniable. For Laci Peterson, however, the legal arguments could never restore what was lost. Her life and her child's life had ended violently. Her story became a painful reminder of how trust can be broken in the most intimate relationships, and how danger does not always come from strangers. As prosecutors prepared their case, they emphasized motive, opportunity, and deception. They argued that Scott saw his wife and unborn child as obstacles to a life he wanted to pursue. This narrative, while chilling, resonated with many who followed the case closely. The investigation phase ended with one clear reality. Justice was no longer a question of if, but how. The courtroom would now determine whether the evidence was enough to hold Scott Peterson accountable for the deaths of Laci and Connor. And as the trial approached, the world waited, hoping that the truth, long buried under lies and loss, would finally be spoken. The trial that followed would become one of the most closely watched criminal cases in American history. When Scott Peterson stood in court, the nation paid attention. The courtroom was filled not only with legal teams and family members, but with the weight of public expectation. For many, this trial was about more than one man's guilt or innocence. It was about whether the justice system could speak for a woman and her unborn child who could no longer speak for themselves. Prosecutors presented a case built on motive, behavior, and a chain of circumstantial evidence that, taken together, told a powerful story. They argued that Scott Peterson wanted freedom from responsibility and that Laci's pregnancy stood in the way of the life he wanted to live. His affair, His lies and his actions after Laci disappeared were presented as signs of deliberate intent rather than coincidence. The prosecution highlighted how Scott had told his mistress that he had lost his wife before Laci was even reported missing. They emphasized the location where Laci and her unborn son were found near the same body of water Scott claimed to have visited on the day she disappeared. Witnesses testified about seeing Scott near the marina, and forensic experts discussed evidence that linked him to the crime scene. Throughout the trial, Laci's family sat quietly, listening to every detail. For them, each testimony reopened wounds. They had already lost a daughter and a grandchild. Now they had to endure hearing the details of how that loss occurred. Still, they remained present, determined to see the process through. The defense, meanwhile, argued that the case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence. They claimed there was no direct proof tying Scott to the murders and suggested alternative theories involving unknown individuals. They questioned the reliability of witness accounts and challenged the interpretation of forensic findings. Their goal was to create reasonable doubt, but public opinion had largely formed long before the verdict. As the trial progressed, the contrast between Scott's calm demeanor and the gravity of the accusations continued to trouble many observers. His lack of visible emotion became a subject of intense debate. While some argued that everyone grieves differently, others saw his behavior as cold and detached. After months of testimony, arguments, and scrutiny, the jury reached its decision. Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Laci Peterson and second-degree murder for the death of their unborn son, Connor. The verdict sent a wave of emotion through the courtroom. For Laci's family, it was a moment of validation mixed with grief. Justice, in a legal sense, had finally been spoken, but it came far too late to save the lives that mattered most. Scott Peterson was sentenced to death, a decision that underscored the severity of the crime. Years later, that sentence would be overturned and replaced with life without the possibility of parole. Following legal challenges related to jury selection, while the sentence changed, the conviction remained. The court reaffirmed that Scott Peterson was responsible for the deaths of his wife and unborn child. For Laci's family, the legal outcomes were never about punishment alone. They were about acknowledgement. They wanted the world to know that Laci mattered, that her life, her dreams, and her child were not footnotes in a sensational case, but the heart of it. Laci Peterson's story continues to resonate because it exposed uncomfortable truths. It showed how violence can exist within seemingly ordinary lives. It challenged assumptions about safety, trust, and intimacy. It reminded society that danger does not always announce itself loudly, and that justice often comes only after irreversible loss. In the years since the trial, Laci has been remembered not just as a victim, but as a symbol. Her story has been discussed in documentaries, books, and courtrooms. Laws regarding victims' rights, the recognition of unborn children in homicide cases were influenced by cases like hers. Her son, Connor, was legally acknowledged as a victim, something that carried profound meaning for families facing similar tragedies. Yet beyond the legal legacy lies a personal one. Laci was a woman who loved simple joys. She was preparing for motherhood, planning a future, and trusting the life she had built. Her story reminds us that justice is not only about verdicts and sentences, it is about listening, believing, and protecting before it is too late. Today, her name still evokes strong emotion, not because of controversy, but because of what was taken. A life, a future, a child who never had the chance to be born. Laci Peterson's story stands as a warning and a call for awareness. It urges us to look beyond appearances, to take concerns seriously, and to recognize that silence can be dangerous. Her legacy is not defined by how she died, but by how her story continues to speak for those who cannot. And in that sense, while justice came through the courts, Laci's true impact lives on in the conversations her story still inspires about accountability, safety, and the value of every life.